Okay, so welcome everyone to Breakfast with Birkbeck. This is our third webinar in the series, and I'm quite excited for this one. Our topic is climate change and neuroscience. How do our brains navigate a changing world? And I'm joined today by Dr. Daniel Yon and Professor Michael Thomas. I'll hand over to them in a second to talk a little bit more about who they are and what they do, but Daniel is director of the Uncertainty Lab at Birkbeck, and Michael is director of the Center for Educational Neuroscience. So, Michael, do you want to start us off maybe with a little bit more about what you do, what you teach, what you research?
Yes, for sure. So, yeah, pleasure being with you today. I'm really excited to talk about this topic. So, yes, my name is Michael Thomas. I am a professor in cognitive neuroscience at Birkbeck, and I'm director of the Center for Educational Neuroscience. So, you might be wondering how neuroscience fits with education. So, the goal of our research center is to take kind of relatively recent insights into brain mechanisms of learning and see how that might be useful to teachers and in an educational context. So what I'll be interested in talking about today is understanding how the brain works and how it responds to threats in the environment, and how we can use that knowledge to help us understand how people might alter their behavior or address the challenges of climate change.
Amazing. And Daniel, do you want to give us your intro?
Sure, great, thank you. I'm really pleased to be here too. As Adrian said, I'm a member of the psychology department here at Birkbeck. I'm a reader in cognitive neuroscience, and I direct the Uncertainty Lab. So a big focus on our research is trying to understand what's happening in the mind and brain when we deal with different kinds of uncertainty, both that arises from the brain itself through the kinds of ambiguity that's inherent in all of our thought processes, but also how we understand and think about uncertainty in the world around us. We study that in a very broad and quite fundamental sense, but we've also recently been moving into understanding how changes in these mental processes and changes in these brain mechanisms might underlie certain kinds of unusual states of mind, like things like paranoia. So I'm particularly interested in being here today to think about climate change as being an example, sort of par excellence, of something uncertain in our present and our future.
Amazing. So let's start off with exactly that topic, uncertainty. Like you mentioned, climate and environmental change are a major source of uncertainty for people. You don't always know exactly what extreme events will happen where or how you'll be affected. So how does that uncertainty affect people's emotional responses to climate change, Daniel? What's the theories on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, one idea that we're really interested in is that your brain's kind of internal estimate of uncertainty about the world is really not segregated. So it's very difficult to have separate kinds of uncertainty attached to lots of different parts of your life. Generally, you try to have one global estimate of how stable or unstable things are, and that can mean that different kinds of uncertainty bleed into each other. And we can see that in the brain. There are various kinds of sort of neural structures that seem to set this global sense of how stable or how volatile the world seems. And in lots of contexts, you can connect those kinds of psychological and brain processes to feelings like anxiety. So it's not just that you would think something like anxiety is connected to always expecting the worst. It might actually be a sense that you just can't really predict what's going to happen next. So you're constantly flipped between different ways of thinking. You'll constantly find that things that you thought were reliable don't seem as reliable anymore. And though that, from a kind of psychological point of view, is quite neutral, you might think that just sounds like being open-minded. Being faced with both the experience of instability, but also just expecting and believing in instability seems to foment lots of kinds of anxiety and dread.
Interesting.
Which maybe isn't a particularly positive note to start off on.
And Michael, from your perspective, how does uncertainty kind of come out, or how does that kind of state of mind that Daniel is describing, what effects does that have in an education setting for learning?
Yeah, so I mean, I think in an educational context, there's a widespread understanding now that the climate crisis and young people's perceptions of the climate crisis has induced a lot of anxiety in young people and contributed to the increase in mental health issues in particularly adolescents and teenagers trying to get their head around the world that they seem to be inheriting from the older generation. I would say it's from a neuroscience perspective, the uncertainty that we're talking about it's kind of challenging in that the brain is mainly constructed to guide your behavior in the present moment and to deliver your immediate goals. So it's there to deal with or optimized for the concrete things in front of you, the immediate consequences, and those consequences that are personally relevant to you. Whereas many of the issues that we're talking about are fairly abstract. There are ideas about greenhouse gases, and we can't really see these kind of greenhouse gases. And there's a lot of belief involved that the particular actions we take, when you add them together across everyone in the world jumping in your car to go to the shops instead of walking to the shops, that the scientists say this is all adding up to negative consequences. And who are those consequences for? Well, they may be for unborn generations, which again is a kind of abstract idea. So some of the uncertainty we're dealing with is do you even believe this stuff, right? And that some of the most recent studies have been looking at the kinds of interventions you might do. This is a very big study published last year looking at trying out different kinds of interventions to alter people's behaviors. This is a global study across over 60 countries with like 60,000 people. And they tried out a bunch of interventions, like some of them, like, you write a letter to your future self, or think about how negative consequences in the future will affect you and your family, these kind of interventions. And the outcomes on behavior really depended on what your prior beliefs were. So we're dealing with this area that it's not just there's a big storm, that's climate change. When I wake up in the morning, will my house still have a roof on? That's immediate, personally relevant. These are big ideas based on lots of kind of cultural knowledge and accepted scientific belief and long-term consequences. And that's the kind of challenge we're facing from an educational perspective.
Interesting. Yeah, it certainly seems like climate change is sometimes perceived as happening in the future. We talk about, projections out to 2100, and I can see how that kind of becomes something that seems very far away. How do we get past that particular kind of distancing that people do, thinking that climate change is happening in the future or in other places? How do we kind of overcome that? Because it seems like lately we're seeing more and more examples where suddenly people are confronted with the impacts in the here and now and aren't really prepared for it because they've been perceiving it as distant. Shall we go back to Daniel for this one? Have you any kind of lessons from the uncertainty research on how we overcome that distancing?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think there's been some really interesting work in trying to understand the role that our sort of imaginations play in thinking about what climate change means and what our futures will be like. And I think part of the distancing you might be describing comes from the ways that our imaginations are perhaps tuned a little bit inappropriately. So there have been some interesting studies where initially, if you get people to imagine what does climate change look like, the modal, most common image that comes to mind is an image of a polar bear on a melting ice cap. And that is obviously it's quite a sort of distressing image. It's an image that says something quite powerful about the impacts that climate change will have on things like biodiversity. And it's not a surprising image, given that it's been the image that people like conservationist charities and campaigners have used for a long time, literally for decades, to kind of illustrate those sorts of ecological impacts. But the problem with that kind of image is most people don't live in the ice caps. Most people don't see polar bears. And it can kind of disguise the way that climate change will have impacts for you personally. So in these studies, what they then do is they can put people into focus groups and get them to think about, what would happen to you in your life if there was a dramatic increase in extreme weather events, for example? Or what would it mean for you if in distant parts of the world that seem far away, they suffered really serious ecological disasters, and that meant that large numbers of refugees were coming into your sort of like towns and cities? How would that change the way that you live your life? And what those kinds of focus groups tend to find is that you can then change what people imagine, and the ways that they then the ways in which their imaginations change end up predicting changes in their attitudes and behavior. So if you then find, for instance, that people start to imagine more local impacts, both positive or negative, part of it's also imagining positive climate futures, thinking about what a future with 100% renewable energy would look like and how that would be a nicer place to live. But beginning to get people, encouraging them to think about local impacts and having those at the forefront of their mind seems to lead to a kind of behavioral activation where people both feel like climate change is a more urgent issue, but also they feel more empowered to go and do something about it.
It makes a lot of sense. Thinking about the imagery issue that you mentioned, I'm wondering, is it like which comes first? Did the media start using polar bears because that's what people imagine, or do people imagine polar bears because that's what they've seen?
I mean, it's a good question. And I think for that particular example, I'm not sure we'll know, but my hunch is that I think the media comes first. I think
Mm.
that people don't, as sort of Michael was saying, these are highly ambiguous, quite abstract concepts to grapple with. And in order to make them concrete in some way, you latch on to the images and the ideas that you've been supplied with. And I think that means that you both have to be careful about the sort of diet of imagery that you're kind of consuming, but also it means that people who are in charge of communicating these messages, who are trying to nudge people towards action, need to think about the kinds of ideas they leave imprinted in the minds of their audiences, I think.
Yeah, makes sense. Just to pick up on that point about imagination again, Michael, yeah, imagination seems to be something that children and young people often have in more abundance, perhaps. And as we go through education, maybe the opportunities for using imagination in the education system start to narrow. Is there any research or any kind of recommendations on how we kind of foster that skill, I guess, of imagination through the education system?
Yeah. See, I'm not sure imagining the future and reasoning things all out is necessarily the way to go. Because as I've talked about from a neuroscience point of view, that the brain is in the personally relevant kind of now. Uh, One of the issues is that we do exist in a commercial media world where a lot of the news stories, there is incentivization in the media to publish stories of a certain sort. So there's a lot of scare clickbait stuff out there because it attracts a lot of views. So we do know from the anxiety literature that there are two principal ways to lower anxiety, and one of those is called cognitive reframing, where you think, well, actually things are not quite as bad as everyone's making them out to be. And, there are good news stories out there. So we have passed the peak of global personal carbon emissions. And it won't be a lot long afterwards until the total amount of emissions is beginning to reduce. The UK is now beginning to consume the majority of clean energy. We've made great advances, but you don't see these kind of positive stories out there in the media. So part of the story is trying to cognitively reframe that it's not quite the crisis it's being made out to be. The second, the anxiety literature tells us, is that you need to get a sense of control. You need to be able to feel that you can do something as a consequence, to control your situation. It's not all out of your control. And in that sense, education initiatives are about trying to give children and young people a sense that there's a stuff that they can do immediately, often in their school grounds, to do things that increase biodiversity, for example, or sustainability of their immediate environment around them, that they can see the consequences of. So there are things like the recent initiative, the National Education Nature Park, of trying to bring together all of the school grounds and create those as a nature park that young people can try and improve. There's the Nature Friendly Schools initiative about trying to encourage use of outdoor classrooms and school grounds to make people more in touch with nature. There is another kind of thorny issue that, as an academic, I think everything's about ideas, right? So you sort of think we just need to win the argument that climate change is a problem and these are the solutions. And once we've won the argument and everyone agrees with us, then everyone's behavior will change. But what we also know from a cognitive neuroscience perspective is that beliefs don't really drive behavior. I mean, they do in part, but there's many other things that drive behavior, and those include emotions. We talked a little bit about that, about worrying about the poor polar bear and so forth. These are like inducing empathy, and it's a mechanism that Daniel talked about, is being often used to manipulate us for good reasons. But emotions drive behavior, particularly rewards and anticipated rewards, and particularly immediate rewards. There's research from neuroeconomics that likes to see how brains work to get you to buy chocolate bars, and they put you in the scanner, and the big thing that seems to drive behavior is not what you think about chocolate bars. It's the area that is predicting anticipated positive rewards. So there's a clear message there that you need to change your behavior. You need to think that something good is coming your way pretty soon as a consequence of that. And then the third thing that is powerful in driving behavior is the social context. So social norms, what everyone else is doing, but also in the social hierarchy, do the people you admire, are they doing this behavior? If you, the Manchester United football team, if you're a fan, are they recycling? Because if they are, I think I will too. It's these kind of other things that we have to think about beyond just the beliefs or the ideas or winning the argument about climate change.
Makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
I think I completely agree that I think when I talk about imagination there, I definitely don't think we should be imagining, 2125. I think it's imagining tomorrow, next week, next month, exactly for the reasons that Michael described, that you have this very strong incentive to discount things that are happening in the very distant future as, even if they might be very consequential, are just not relevant to you. And that partly about what you could think about imagination as being imagining a very distant future, or just imagining a very different local concrete environment that you live in now. So yeah, I think I completely agree with you there, as I promised I would.
Makes a lot of sense. Picking up on that point about what seems to drive behavior, you mentioned that it's emotions, social influences, and anticipated rewards driving it. Do you find that certain emotions or influences lead more to positives or lead more to positive action? Are there some that lead to inaction? Are there some emotions that can lead to inaction? Or can both negative emotions and positive emotions both lead to positive action, if that makes sense?
I think that what the general neuroscience would tell you is that positivity is what energizes action. So even in non-human animals, you find these kind of evolutionary ancient pathways where, in the presence of maybe something good happening, all of your action systems get going. They kind of motivate you to pursue this thing that might be kind of rewarding and pleasant in the environment. Whereas in the presence of threat, or the presence of something negative, the kind of fear of punishment, that generally leads to freezing or escape. So if you look at that in In a mouse, it will be that, if you have a looming owl silhouette fly over a mouse, the mouse gets scared about what might happen next, and it doesn't, try to energize itself. It just freezes in the hope that the threat will go away. And you can see that same kind of circuit conserved in the human brain, whereby in the presence of reward, we feel like we can be energized and active. But in the presence of something bad happening in the near future, we freeze. And though I think people have never put someone in a scanner while they actively think about the threat of there being a severe storm or a fire tomorrow, my guess would be, given this common currency for how we treat all these threats and rewards, you'll be much better trying to motivate action with carrots rather than sticks, because sticks will kind of by definition have a freezing rather than energizing impact.
It makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
I'm gonna jump in there and say that as in many cases things then get a bit more complicated. So I completely agree with Daniel, and this is one of the challenges of if you're a charity, or if you're a government, or if you're the United Nations, you feel like your go-to is to start messaging about, it's 5 minutes to midnight, we're at the tipping point, this is a crisis, it's all going to be disasters, because you do indeed think there's a threat and you want to induce behavioral change. But what we know about that is that you get really unpredictable results from people when you use threat messaging. So as Daniel says, in some cases you get a fight response. Right, I'm going to recycle from tomorrow, I'm turning the heating down. These are action responses to the threat. But you can also get fight responses from other people who say, what are all these policymakers doing, telling me all this nonsense? All this climate change, I'm not going for, so it's like an aggression towards the person giving the message. As Daniel says, you can get kind of freeze response, or you can get flight response, where I can't be reading any more of this negative news. I'm just going to run away from it. So because you get this unpredictable response, threat messaging is not your most efficient way to change behavior. As Daniel says, reward is more powerful. Anticipated rewards, you can save that polar bear and you'll feel a lot better about that. Just insulate the house. Think of that savings on your energy bill, how much money you're going to save. This is kind of positive thing. But the other side of it is, and this is something that educators have to think about, is that sometimes science teachers need to make their kids feel bad about things going wrong, and that is part of, there are negative consequences. We can't soft soap everything, but also that kind of vigilance causes engagement. People will pay attention more, but you have to think carefully as a teacher about inducing those kind of emotions in your children. The other thing we know is this is about reward learning as well, that we tend to discount future rewards, right? So someone says, insulate your house, it'll cost you £5,000 this year, it'll save you £20,000 over 5 years, but but that's in 5 years, and I really, that spending that £5,000, I don't want to do that. And there's things that policymakers do about that. You can get a grant, right? Bring the reward forward in time, that'll help. But also we do know that the brain tends to discount future losses less than it does future rewards. So if you talk about, say that a forest is going to be destroyed, our brain kind of thinks if it's destroyed tomorrow or in 10 years, it's still destroyed. We don't seem to discount negative outcomes as much as we do future positive rewards. So the picture is sort of complicated, and I would broadly agree that the carrot's going to be more effective than the stick. But in some circumstances, we need to be real about threat, but not to manipulate people, just to kind of put them in the picture.
What you're discussing is reminding me a bit of this paper that analyzed the metaphors that the IPCC uses for communicating about climate concepts. And the argument that was being made was that talking about it in terms of a budget or a deadline and things like that was kind of creating this scarcity, could create this scarcity mindset for people, that they feel like they're running out of time or there isn't enough space to kind of solve things. And I guess it kind of makes me think about the challenges around language, how we talk about these things, like the the metaphors, the words we use. So I'm wondering if, thinking about particularly the intergenerational impacts of climate change that we mentioned previously, are there any recommendations you'd make in terms of how we talk about this with children and young people to support them and kind of create these more positive states or propensity towards positive action? Is there anything we can do there to improve things in terms of how we teach and talk about it?
Yeah, so we do, as a species, find it hard to think about the abstract. We're privileged as a species that we can think about the abstract and the wonderful technology that's been produced. It's culture and technology that has generated this problem. It's not the human brain per se, right? And we got ourselves into this. We can get ourselves out of it. So, this kind of broadly positive message, but we need to have concrete examples and things that we can envisage to support our abstract ideas. But you're quite right. The kinds of concrete examples that we have, about things being on fire, and trying to ideas brought into your minds, and the kind of imagery you see, it can have negative consequences. It can have these kind of threat consequences. So I'm in favor of concrete examples, but not as part of an agenda to kind of scare people into action, but to help support their understanding of, there is consensus science about this, and here's how we think it works. And then here are the concrete actions that you personally can take. And when you get that sense of understanding about what's real and what is not real, and then what you can do about it, that's the kind of thing that contributes to a reduction of anxiety and an increase in collective action.
Daniel, how about from your research, are there any kind of tips that you would give in terms of how we communicate these concepts or how we communicate about the uncertainty, perhaps?
Yeah, well, I think mine's probably a bit more speculative, but I would think there's something a bit strange about how we communicate climate change and that we don't really communicate the change. I think that it feels like though you talk about it as a kind of unpredictable thing in our future, lots of the messaging you get from, intergovernmental bodies makes it sound as though we're on a railroad track and we're just slowly going towards all of these negative consequences of decisions that happened sort of decades ago. And I think, though I told you at the beginning that experiencing change and experiencing new and unexpected things can give you a sense of anxiety, there is an upside to that, which is that seeing change and believing that change is happening makes you feel that more change is possible. So I think some of the concrete examples that Michael talks about, my guess on how the mechanism of those changing your mind would be they give you a sense that you're not just stuck on a single track, but there are many ways that tomorrow and the day after and the day after might look. And if you can communicate that sense of labelity to things, the fact that things might be different to the way they are now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's not that we're doomed to some negative consequences, but there are multiple ways that the world might look. And once you start to communicate those messages, at least in non-climate change settings, we find that against that abstract ambiguity, believing that change might be on the horizon really does change how flexible people are in thinking. They much more readily change their actions and change their beliefs when they think that more change will be afoot. So actually, yeah, trying to communicate that it's not all this stuff is a foregone conclusion and we're just sort of tinkering around the edges of a kind of unstoppable disaster. I think actually cultivating that sense that things could be different and they could be different in positive ways.
That's a really nice message to finish on. So we're going to move into Q&A next. I'm going to stop the recording before then, but thank you so much for the discussion. It's been really interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you.